Welcome to MicroSwitch. It's a controls problem short segments. This week featuring previous guest Scott Sammarco. So we use Wi-Fi for just about everything in our daily lives, from streaming movies to checking our front door cameras, and it usually feels like solid rock. So why is that not so in the world of building automation? Using Wi-Fi for BACnet often feels like a risky experiment rather than the industry standard.
So that's a really good question and it's a great observation, right? And if you've ever looked into the building automation industry from afar, say you are from IT and networking, and you're interested in building automation, you would notice this trend that building automation is always 10 years in the past. And if you're on government sector or public sector, you're 10 years behind that. So if we bring ourselves to 20, maybe even 30 years in the past, what kind of communications did we have? Early internet? We had a lack of cybersecurity? Or, I mean, the birth of it and all of the vulnerabilities that the internet showed us and ultimately became part of our reality in everyday lives. And then we're also talking about communications protocols that were around before the internet protocol or before IP. And those are BACnet and Modbus. Now, there are other communications protocols. You can even make your own serial communications, so be it. But the difference comes in how these things communicate. So we have to define the OSI model. And if you have ever studied the OSI model, this will be a great transition and a great thing to associate to what you already know. And if you are familiar, we're specifically talking about layer 4. We're talking about UDP traffic versus TCP traffic. So what is TCP? A transport communication protocol. That's the type of protocol most things use over Wi-Fi. For example, if you're walking around your house on FaceTime on your phone, you're probably using some type of app, or you're on your email on your laptop walking around, you are using TCP type of traffic. What's awesome about TCP is we can allow things like HTTP headers. We can start leveraging certificates where we can verify we are who we say we are. That's really what a certificate is for. We can start to deploy other cybersecurity measures to protect what's called the triad. And I know I'm throwing a lot of acronyms out here, but there's a lot of different industries really coming together to create this photo of what TCP traffic is. So with TCP traffic, we might have a little bit of latency. You guys, and I say you guys, but in general, people have noticed that sometimes your phone might get the email before your Outlook application did. And that's primarily by the means of transport, or TCP. There's nothing wrong with that. It has high fidelity. It has high integrity. It verified who it came from, the contents of the message. That's kind of the opposite of what UDP traffic is, or user datagram protocol. And so how UDP differs is it didn't necessarily encrypt any data. It didn't use certificates to verify who it was. It said, oh, I have a package or a packet of information that I'm supposed to send someplace. Just send it. I don't know if it got it. I don't know if it'll ever get it. When we use TCP traffic, there's something called a three-way handshake, or SYN-ACK, where, hi, Matt, good morning. You acknowledge me, and then I acknowledge that you acknowledge me. So there's high certainty that you got my message, and I confirmed that you got it, and you confirmed that you got mine. So we're in this connection, right? Where UDP isn't that way. It's very, hey, Matt, who says you ever answered? So let's create an analogy between UDP and TCP to further strengthen our understanding. I want you guys to imagine that there's and I'm actually recalling this from a class. I say this all the time in class, so out of habit, I'll say you guys. But imagine there is a FedEx truck driving down the road. And if we had TCP traffic, that truck is a TCP type of a device that has all of these packages. The delivery driver parks the truck, gets your package, walks up to your door, wherever the address is. Your front door knocks. He has you sign for the package. He gives you a receipt, and he walks away. Everyone knows what happened, right? Sin, sinak, ac. He established a connection. You acknowledged it by signing it. He handed you a receipt. Your receipt says that you got the package that he gave to you. He'll have a copy, and he can keep driving away. There's a high certainty that the right person who signed for the package got it. Great. Awesome. If that's TCP, what UDP traffic would be is that FedEx driver driving down the road, never bothering to ever stop or pull over, and there's a guy out of the back of the truck with the door open just chucking packages in the general right direction. Even if it had your address on it, ABC Street, address 123 at the front door, it's just sending it in the front lawn. There's no verification that that particular person actually got that message. So some major differences, right? UDP is very, very fast. It doesn't take a lot of bandwidth or information over time to send that package out. Where if you could imagine the FedEx and UPS drivers having to get a signature for every single package they ever delivered, they wouldn't deliver nearly as many packages as they're asked to. There are some goods and bads with both of them, right? It's not that one is superior to the other. It's that they're really designed for different things. Where UDP is very lightweight, the reason that I think we still see this protocol in our building automation systems industry is because it doesn't take expensive hardware to run. It's been around a long time. It's been proven. Generally speaking, manufacturers aren't going to change a technology that's well proven. It's just kind of the case, right? Like, if it's not broke, why fix it? But when people are solving problems with modern hardware like computers that generally have a lot of what's called overhead, and they have a lot of processing power, a lot of memory, significantly more than our BAS devices, TCP traffic is a drop in the sea. It doesn't care. It has so much to handle, it just doesn't care about that little bit. We're asking, a $300 device from 2004, yeah, that might consume a lot of resources for not a whole lot of benefit. Conversely, where we're talking about TCP, yes, it requires more overhead. Yes, it might be more secure. And really, TCP is becoming more popular because of all of those security features that it can be baked in or that are native to the protocol. So with TCP, talking about other OSI model layers, we can start talking about session authentication and other layers that add more and more security. With UDP, we don't have those same types of things, right? We don't have certificates necessarily. Could we with BACnet Secure Connect? Sure. You could encrypt communications. I mean, really, how often are we seeing BACnet SC deployed? I haven't seen it very much, only a handful of times. And I'd be interested to see if people that are listening have seen or heard of a lot of BACnet SC. I mean, heck, I still hear about BACnet MSTP being installed in new buildings. And I'm like, why? If you're running a cable, you could at least run BACnet over IP. Run a Cat6 cable. Another reason that we don't see BACnet over Wi-Fi so frequently is because it's UDP traffic and we're not using those security protocols, the surface area for somebody to attack that device is a whole lot higher. What do I mean by that? Well, if it's a regular BACnet device, you'd have to physically connect to it, right? You have to daisy chain in the network, know what the subnet is, have an available address, an available device ID. Well, if you're over Wi-Fi, you could theoretically scan the environment. What BACnet devices are available? Who is IM message? Just start getting replies. And now you can start attacking these devices and sending nefarious messages to them to have them act and do different things without ever having to need a physical connection.
Right. The IT hurdle to the whole process to switch to wireless versus
right
on the physical network.
Right. So there's the cybersecurity vulnerabilities, right? All of a sudden, that surface area of attack is a lot higher. And if we're not using standard security protocols, like using certificates or different types of encryptions and keys, well, now we're really just kind of opening it up to the world, aren't we? And anybody that's just driving down the road could theoretically connect to your Wi-Fi and start wrecking havoc.
Just like anybody could go and pick up the package out of your yard and walk away with it.
Ah, that's a great point. Absolutely. Where if you know the FedEx guy handed you the package and you signed for it, there's a pretty good chance no one's stealing it between you and the FedEx guy.
Right. It shifts the liability quite a bit.
Absolutely. It eliminates that liability even. It avoids it and administratively just eliminates it. Yeah, absolutely. It's a good point. I think there's one other thing that is important to recognize and understand. When we're talking about the first layer of the OSI model, which is the physical layer, when we're talking about backing it over MSTP, we're typically talking about RS-485 or the two conductors with the reference daisy-chained between devices. When devices talk over Wi-Fi, that layer 1 connection becomes the atmosphere. Right? We kind of talked about that a little bit. We have to consider the variables that are in the atmosphere. There's electrical noise just by being on Earth. There's electrical noise from the sun with solar flares, with solar rays. There's electrical noise from everything that transmits anything at all.
Yeah, HVAC creates electrical noise.
Anything that produces current, right, would theoretically create electromagnetic interference or
friction. Yeah.
Right, friction, right? You can have static electricity. Like, there's a lot of things that create noise, and that's a technical term, right? So what ends up happening is we're allowed so much space in the Wi-Fi spectrum. One of the newer additions to create more channels of communicating is the Wi-Fi with 5G. Remember years ago we had just 2G Wi-Fi, and it wasn't called 2G Wi-Fi, but then we added 5G. We had to tell you which network you were on. That was because you could only get so many devices on those channels for that network. So what ended up happening was the FCC is going to say, hey, we're going to allocate this part of the spectrum available for these types of devices. Well, there's only so much space there. And by space, I really mean bandwidth. And with our economical and relatively cheap hardware, they typically don't like to stay in that little band. They often overmodulate and take up more bandwidth than they're supposed to. That became a really big problem in the early 2000s, and if you want to do your research, you could look up the FCC wide to narrowband transition. It's where everyone's bandwidth was cut in half, and manufacturers had to keep up with that and make new hardware to support that. So when we did that, and we start adding more devices, we have to use more of the spectrum, we need more channels. What happens when we add our 30,000th device? Is there space on the spectrum for that? And 30,000 might seem like a lot, but when we accumulate all of the noise, all of the clutter, it's another technical term, when we talk about all these things that could interfere with our network, sometimes you're lucky to get 50 devices on a Wi-Fi network. There's a lot of things going on. And 50 is not a lot for a BIS. Imagine a building with only 50 devices. It's a relatively small building. And that's another limiting factor. And then we have other issues and other technologies like things called radio desensitization, where if I had two radios, two BAS Wi-Fi devices over BACnet, but one was pushing through its antenna 35 watts, and the device next to it was trying to detect a really, really small signal from another device, it could potentially desensitize this radio where it tries to lower all of the signals because one's too strong, and in that it lowers the signal it's trying to hear, and then it becomes indistinguishable from noise. So now this particular Wi-Fi device can't receive its signals reliably. And that's a real fear that genuinely happens in our everyday lives.
Oh, yeah, I have
Even
an
if you're
example
on a
of
phone call.
Yeah, I have an example right here in my office, home office setup. Is my router has 5 gigahertz and 2.5 gigahertz that it's communicating on, and then Bluetooth operates on 2.5 gigahertz. On my particular router, I cannot shut off 2.5 gigahertz. I can tell it everything else in the house to not connect at that range and connect only to the 5 or to the 6 it also has. But this will interfere with if I hook my mouse up to Bluetooth, the router being so in the same proximity will interfere with my mouse and start
doing weird things
this over the screen. Can't get to what can't be accurate.
Right.
It's jittery.
So it very well could be radio desensitization.
Yeah, it's a radio
it could be a
desensitization.
Harmonic, right? But they're both radios. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, it's radio interference. Yeah,
it is. Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's funny that you actually have to experience that right here in your living room.
Yeah, and I had to go through and find a solution to it. I had to figure that out. And so, multiplying that to a building full of equipment on Wi-Fi and other things operating on different radio frequencies, can imagine how much of a headache that can be.
Right. And then who's going to hire a radio frequency engineer to say, I need the 11th harmonic of this? Like, nobody's going to do that. Like, no one's going to invest the time or money. They're going to say, go run a cable. And it's funny. So that's why we're kind of stuck with not only wired connections, but with UDP traffic, because it keeps the cost of the devices down. So here we are as an industry kind of keeping ourselves down until somebody comes out with newer technology, usually in an adjacent market or a different industry entirely. And BS will say, that's a good idea. Let's redeploy that here. And I've noticed that trend happens really frequently in our industry. Somebody else will have a great idea, right. They'll innovate, and it basically gets copied or integrated into what we do. I'm so glad you have an example of that. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's fun. I've been wanting to tell somebody about that because that drove me nuts.
Yes. So that's a radio interference, specifically whether it's harmonics or radio desensitization. It could be a little bit of both. That's really cool. I'm surprised that you had to experience that.
Perfect moment for it.
Right, it really was. So why couldn't we? And ask your question, Matt, because I feel like, Matthew, because I feel like I've been talking a lot, but I'm interested to hear what questions you have, or maybe what ideas we could talk about further. So we've talked about user datagram protocol, or UDP traffic, which is typically what we use with BACnet and in our industry entirely. And we've also talked about TCP, or Transport Communication Protocol. We talked about how UDP is fast, lightweight, relatively insecure, and typically requires a wired connection. The exclusion of that being BACnet over Wi-Fi, and we've talked about why that's really not widely deployed. With TCP, although it often requires more overhead or processing power, or maybe better hardware is a way to put that, we also have better information. There's data correction. There's ways to determine that the message hasn't been altered. We can leverage certificates. If TCP wasn't this way, every time you looked at some news app or whatever, you're on Facebook, there's a reason the memes aren't stupid and broken. It's because it's using TCP traffic. If we sent our memes over UDP, first, it'd be very slow.
You're right.
Second, a lot of them would come out broken, and you'd be curious as to why.
Right, so, you'd get the half-loaded image.
Right, exactly. So really, there are two different ways to communicate, but they were designed for two different purposes and two different applications entirely.
So that all makes me think of a fun experiment we can do in our next episode. If we want to ditch the RS-485 cable and go with a Wi-Fi process for BACnet, why don't we experiment with the idea of a Wi-Fi where the bridge is gapped, the Wi-Fi technology, the bridge is gapped by BACnet SC, and bring in those communication security standards into the practice and see how that actually plays out in the real world.
That would be interesting to try, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I think that's a great idea. I'd love to see BACnet SC done over Wi-Fi with all of the cool features that we would expect from TCP over that particular protocol, BACnet over SC. That would be really great without having to necessarily reinvent the entire wheel. Another idea, while you were talking, came to me, is in the radio world, there's something called leaky loosey cable. And so what they do is they buy coaxial cable and they drill holes in in the insulation and dielectric in certain positions to allow the electromagnetic intelligence and the frequency to bleed or leak at certain parts of the cable. That might be another alternative, and combining all of those, you might have a hybrid network with leaky loosey coax cable with those awesome security protocols, with the speed that we're looking for. That would be really cool, wouldn't it?
It would.
I'd love to see that technology.
I think we should investigate that.
Especially in historic buildings, right? Where we can't drill through a wall and the wall is made of concrete from the Civil War. What do you do in that scenario?
Right.
You go outside the building to go underground and back in? Sounds like a lot of work. Just saying.
Yeah, let's figure out if there might be a new solution for the industry to test out here. Well, thanks for joining today, Scott. Really appreciate your insight and learning more about UDP versus TCP and how that all works. And we will, everybody listening, we'll be back soon with another short episode, and we'll run that experiment and see if it works in real life.
Woohoo! Thanks for your time, Matthew. I appreciate you.
Thanks, Scott.